Okay, this screencast is going to begin with one of the second land battles that occurs during World War I in France, and that is the Battle of the Somme. The Somme refers to a river in France. It's actually a British attack. They launch an attack against the Germans at the Somme in order to take some pressure off of the French who had been fighting during this time at Verdun. So we talked about the Battle of Verdun in class. The Battle of the Somme overlaps it, happening kind of in the middle of Verdun. British are trying to give their French allies a break. Some French are as well fighting there, but they're trying to give the French at Verdun a break. So this kind of actually becomes known as one of the biggest disasters in British military history. It is a months-long battle in which the English military bombards Germany for weeks on weeks on weeks, but they don't gain ever a whole lot of land. They gained a few miles, but they lost thousands and thousands of men. They actually lost 1/3 of their total casualties on the very first day of battle, which just shows the terrible conditions that are trench warfare. And actually, the whole 1/3 of their men remains a military record still today, a one-day casualty record. By the end of the battle, you had a total between all sides of over 400,000 soldiers. And again, not a whole lot of land gained by the Allies. So it's just, even though they were able to push the Germans back a little bit, it's not really considered as a huge victory because of how bad the casualty rates are. I want to now kind of talk about the war at sea, which is kind of becoming a more prominent aspect of the war, including what's going to bring the United States into things. So the British are blockading Germany's port cities, basically trying to cut off their trade. And there are enough British ships in the British Navy to kind of patrol the whole northern coastline of Germany and not let any ships in or out. And that's going to have some pretty dramatic repercussions. We've talked about the U-boats already. The U-boats are the German subs. There are German submarines all over the Atlantic Ocean, kind of preying on any ship it finds. Basically, it didn't have to be a military ship. If it was a ship of the Allies, even a merchant ship, the German subs would sink that ship without warning. And this is known as unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare is what is eventually going to bring the United States into this war. But just be aware that the U-boats are doing this. A few laws I want you to keep in mind, not necessarily that you need to take notes on, but we're about to talk about one of the biggest events of the war, and so we kind of want to have this perspective. The Lusitania. Before we get there, in that event, let's talk about what maritime law is. Maritime law referencing like the laws of the seas during this time. So when you were in a ship, you were supposed to fly the flag of your country. You were supposed to warn any non-military ship prior to you attacking it, so they had a time to abandon the boat and clear the ship before you would sink it. You also were supposed to send out an SOS in order to pick up survivors of the attack. And lastly, just something to consider, passenger liners, commercial liners that are just transporting people to and from one country to another via the water, they are not to be transporting any weapons of any kind. And just kind of keep these laws in mind when we get to the event that is the Lusitania. So, in spring of 1915, a German U-boat is going to sink a British cruise ship called the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was on its way from New York City to England. Now, it is a British cruise ship, but because it left New York City, you could imply that there are many Americans on board, and indeed, over 120 Americans did die in this attack, which is going to turn American public opinion flat out against the Germans during this war. FYI, years later, we found out that the Lusitania was carrying civilians from New York City to to England, but it was also carrying weapons for England that the Americans were selling to the British. So it was kind of like hiding the weapons on board, making it a more liable target for Germany. So that was really not good that America was doing that, because it kind of put their civilians at risk who did not know that there were weapons on board. Honestly, until this point, Americans weren't that super excited about World War I or getting involved, but there's going to be a public outcry to unite with the British and declare war against the Germans after this sinking happens. But the U.S. just isn't quite ready to jump in just yet. This is kind of that scene from Iron Jawed Angels, in which they're trying to hold off this type of, war involvement. They're happy that Wilson is keeping them out for now, but eventually we will get involved. Here are just some pictures of the cruise ship. Kind of looks a lot like what you imagine the Titanic to have looked like, which sunk some years earlier than this. Okay, we're now going to transition really quickly to one other thing. I want to get into the buildup of our involvement in the war so that we can pick up with our direct involvement in the war in class tomorrow. So, right before, just kind of give some background before the Lusitania sunk, in general, Americans, were hoping for an Allied victory over a Central Powers victory. Most of them weren't really interested in getting involved. But through several events, by 1917, the Americans will have mobilized and prepared for our involvement in World War I. Two big reasons we mobilized. One, to ensure the Allied repayment of debts to the United States. We basically are going to start loaning money and weapons to the Allies. And we want to ensure that they win so that they're able to repay those debts eventually. So we want to kind of help them finish the war. But also, Germany's really going to bring us into it based on their unrestricted submarine warfare. To kind of refresh your memories with what was happening in the water. First, the British blockade. So England was blockading German ports. Now, we actually were not in support of this, and we were actually quite angry at England for blockading the ports of Germany, because this really prohibits any sort of free trade. And as a result of that prohibiting free trade, several thousand German citizens will die during World War I merely because they're not getting the goods and resources they need. So there's lots of people actually starving to death, which is really upsetting. So Americans in general are fairly angry with England over this style of fighting. However, Germany will respond with that unrestricted submarine warfare, which is even worse. Essentially, any British or Allied ship that was found in the water would be sunk by a German U-boat. It was not always that Germany warned any sort of ship of an impending attack so that they could abandon ship or evacuate the ship. They would often just destroy an enemy boat, and the passengers on that boat would be killed. The Lusitania was one of the worst examples of this, and we talked about that. Basically, we're being very provoked with the sinking of the Lusitania because of how many Americans were on the boat. But there are actually two other instances in which ships are sank with American civilians, and that is the sinking of the Arabic and the Sussex. So there are two ships that follow the Lusitania in which American civilians also were killed, but not compared to the numbers of the Lusitania. But Americans are very much becoming hostile towards Germany, wanting to declare war on Germany to fight against these unrestricted attacks against civilians. And this is really going to be the final nail in the coffin of turning Americans against the Germans and wanting to go to war against them and allying themselves with England and France. We'll talk about the specific event that will lead the U.S. to declare war in class tomorrow. So if you want to just pause your notes, write down any questions, and I will see y'all tomorrow.